Night, Garrett Mullins buried his best friend. He stood at the edge of the cemetery parking lot for a long time, not moving, just watching the last cars pull away. The rain had stopped an hour ago, but the grass was still wet, and the mud had crept into his shoes somewhere around the third shovelful of dirt. He didn't notice. He was thinking about two little girls sitting in a hospital waiting room 20 miles away, and a social worker who had already called him twice that evening asking what was going to happen to them. He didn't have an answer. He was 34 years old, divorced, living in a two-bedroom apartment in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, working 60 hours a week as a structural engineer for a company called Aldrin Solutions. He had a coffee maker and a second-hand couch, and exactly one framed photograph on his wall. Him and his friend Brody, taken at a Pirates game, both of them grinning like they had no idea what was coming. Brody was gone now. A heart defect nobody had caught. 41 years old. Gone in 11 minutes on the floor of a grocery store while his two daughters waited in the car. The girl's mother had left when they were small. There were no grandparents still living, no aunts, no uncles on either side. When Garrett had sat down with the social worker the week before, she had laid it out plainly. The girls, Petra, who was 9, and Kala, who was 6, would go into the foster system and likely be placed separately because finding a home for two children at once, especially at their ages, was statistically difficult. Separately. Garrett had driven home that night and sat at his kitchen table for 4 hours. He thought about Brody teaching him how to throw a curveball in the summer of 1998. He thought about the time Brody had driven 3 hours to sit with him in a hospital waiting room when Garrett's father had a stroke, without being asked, without even calling ahead. He just showed up. He called the social worker back at 6 in the morning. "What do I need to do," he said, "to keep them together?" What followed was not a graceful process. Garrett was not a man built for paperwork in the way some people are, the kind who approach a form the way a surgeon approaches a procedure, calmly, methodically, with everything labeled. He was the kind of man who lost his car keys 3 times a week and ate cereal for dinner more nights than he would admit. But he learned. He filed the emergency placement request. He attended the parenting classes on Tuesday evenings after 10-hour shifts. He child-proofed the apartment with the help of a YouTube tutorial and a friend named Desmond, who brought a toolbox and didn't ask too many questions. Petra arrived first. She sat in the back seat of Garrett's car with her backpack on her lap and her seatbelt fastened before he even asked, and she did not speak for the first 20 minutes of the drive. When they stopped at a red light, she said, quietly, "My dad talked about you." "Yeah," Garrett said. "He said you were the most stubborn person he'd ever met." Garrett laughed, which surprised him. He wasn't wrong. Petra looked out the window. He said that like it was a good thing. Kala came 2 days later. She was smaller than Garrett had expected. He didn't have much experience with 6-year-olds. And she carried a stuffed rabbit that was missing one ear. She walked into the apartment, looked around at the bare walls and the mismatched furniture and said, "Where's our room?" "Down the hall," Garrett said. "I painted it. I wasn't sure what color you'd want, so I went with yellow. If you hate it, we can repaint." Kala walked down the hall. He heard the door open. A long pause. "I don't hate it," she called back. That was the beginning. Garrett's apartment was not built for 3 people. Within a month, he had moved to a rental house on Clement Street. More square footage, a small backyard, a school district that Petra's teacher had told him was decent. The rent was $400 more per month than he could comfortably afford. He picked up a consulting side job on weekends. He started brown bagging lunch every day instead of eating out. He stopped buying new clothes. He did the math every Sunday night in a notebook with a pencil, the old-fashioned way, because looking at the numbers on a screen made them feel more permanent than he could handle. At Aldrin Solutions, he was what his manager, a man named Fletcher, called the guy you put on the impossible projects. He had a particular talent for load-bearing analysis, calculating how much stress a structure could hold before it failed. He had filed 7 patents in his 9 years at the company. 4 of those patents were now the basis of Aldrin's flagship construction software, a platform they licensed to firms across the Northeast for fees Garrett had never seen a dollar of beyond his regular salary. He had signed those rights away in his original employment contract back when he was 25 and mostly just relieved to have a job. He didn't think about it much at the time. He thought about it more later. The girls settled in the way children do when they are resilient and have no other option. Gradually, then suddenly. Petra started doing her homework at the kitchen table while Garrett cooked dinner, occasionally asking him questions he couldn't answer about her social studies assignments. He started looking things up alongside her, which she seemed to find equal parts amusing and mortifying. Calla developed opinions about breakfast. She would eat scrambled eggs only if they were made with butter and not oil, and she would tell you so directly without apology. She lost 2 teeth in 1 month and left them in a small plastic bag on the kitchen counter with a note that said, "Tooth," because she was 6, and thought labeling things was important. There were hard nights. Petra woke up crying twice in the first month, and both times Garrett sat outside her door and didn't say anything, just let her know he was there. He wasn't sure if that was right. He wasn't sure about a lot of things. But he showed up, every time without being asked, the way Brody once had for him. The trouble at Aldrin started small, the way trouble usually does. In the spring of the girls' second year with him, a structural assessment came across Garrett's desk, a routine review of the load specifications for a parking structure Aldrin had designed for a commercial developer in Allentown. Garrett ran the numbers twice, then a third time. Then he went down the hall to find his colleague Sonia, who had 15 years on him and a healthy distrust of round numbers. "Look at this," he said, setting the file on her desk. Sonia looked. She put her reading glasses on. She looked longer. "That's a 30% shortfall on the vertical load tolerance." "Yeah." "Who approved this?" "Fletcher." Sonia took her glasses off. "How long has this structure been operational?" 14 months. A parking structure with a 30% shortfall in vertical load tolerance and 14 months of daily traffic. Garrett wrote up the safety concern formally that afternoon, attached his calculations, and submitted it to Fletcher with a request for an immediate third-party review. Fletcher thanked him, told him he'd look into it, and moved on. 3 weeks later, nothing had changed. Garrett submitted the concern again, this time copying the regional safety compliance officer, a woman named Helen Marsh, who sat in the Philadelphia office and who Garrett had met exactly once at a company retreat. He did not know if she was the right person to copy. He did it anyway. Fletcher called him into his office the following Monday morning. He was not angry, exactly. Fletcher was not a man who showed anger directly. He was the kind of man who expressed displeasure as mild disappointment, which was somehow worse. "You went around me," Fletcher said. "I flagged a safety issue through the proper escalation channel. You made Aldrin look negligent." "The structure is negligent," Garrett said. "The report shows a 30% shortfall." "The report," Fletcher said carefully, "is being reviewed." "It's been 3 weeks. These things take time." Garrett looked at him. "Fletcher, that structure is holding 800 cars a day." The meeting ended. The review did not accelerate. 6 weeks later, on a Wednesday afternoon in October, a section of the upper deck of the Allentown parking structure buckled under the weight of a delivery truck that had been parked on the roof level. No one was killed, but a man named Roy Cassell, 47 years old, on his lunch break, suffered a spinal injury from falling debris that left him unable to walk. Garrett heard about it on the evening news before Aldrin sent any internal communication. He came to work the next morning and handed Fletcher a written account of every communication he had submitted over the previous 2 months. Along with his formal resignation. He did not yell. He did not make a scene. He packed the contents of his desk into a box, carried it to his car, and drove to pick up Calla from school because it was his day for pickup, and nothing about that had changed. 3 weeks later, a letter arrived informing him that Aldrin Solutions was pursuing legal action against him for breach of confidentiality, specifically for sharing proprietary engineering calculations with an outside compliance officer, which the company argued violated his original employment contract. He read the letter sitting at the kitchen table, the same table where Petra did her homework and Calla ate her eggs. He set it face down when Calla came in and asked what was for dinner. "Pasta," he said. "Can we have butter instead of sauce?" "Yeah," he said, "we can have butter." The lawsuit went nowhere ultimately. The company's legal footing was shaky and they knew it. The confidentiality clause Garrett had allegedly violated was poorly written, and a first-year attorney could have argued around it. But the process took 14 months. 14 months of legal fees Garrett did not have, of consultations with an attorney named Bev Strickler who worked out of a small office in Mechanicsburg and who took his case at a reduced rate because, she told him, What Aldrin had done to Roy Castle made her angry in a way she didn't feel like being professional about. Roy Castle settled separately with Aldrin for an undisclosed amount. The parking structure was quietly retrofitted. No executive was charged with anything. Fletcher received a promotion. Garrett spent those 14 months freelancing, smaller firms, project-by-project work, nothing stable. He stretched money in ways he hadn't since his first years out of college. He said no to field trips he couldn't afford, and yes to the ones he could. He coached Petra's soccer team because it cost nothing and she had asked if he would. He became the kind of father. He had started to think of himself that way, quietly, without ceremony. Who knew which flavor of toothpaste Calla would tolerate, and which days Petra needed to be left alone after school, and which days she needed someone to ask. He didn't talk to the girls about the lawsuit. They were too young for the details. But children understand more than adults give them credit for. And one evening Petra sat down across from him at the kitchen table while he was going over documents and said, "Is everything okay?" "Working on it," he said. "Dad," she said. She had started calling him that somewhere in the second year, casually, as if it were obvious. "You always say that." "Because I'm always working on it," he said. "That's kind of the whole deal." She picked up one of the documents, looked at it without understanding any of it, set it back down. "Okay," she said. "Then, do you need more coffee?" He laughed. "I'm fine." "I'm going to make more coffee," she said, and got up. That was Petra. The lawsuit ended. The freelancing stabilized. Garrett eventually landed a position as lead structural consultant for a mid-sized firm called Crossfield Partners, which was small enough that his work had visible impact and professional enough that his patents, new ones, this time owned by him properly, could be developed. Over the next 8 years, he filed 9 more patents. He had learned, the hard way, how to read a contract. He did not think much about Aldrin's solutions during those years. It was a chapter he had closed, not dramatically, just firmly, the way you close a door that leads somewhere you don't need to go anymore. He thought about the girls. Petra went to Penn State on a partial academic scholarship and supplemented it with a work-study position and, in her junior and senior years, a coding job she had landed by teaching herself to program in her bedroom over a single summer. She had Brody's jaw and Garrett's stubbornness, and she used both to considerable effect. Calla went to Drexel for architecture. She had announced this decision at 13 and had never wavered from it, which Garrett found both admirable and slightly alarming, having always assumed that teenagers were supposed to change their minds. Calla was not that kind of teenager. Calla was the kind of teenager who made a 5-year plan at 13 and then executed it. Garrett drove them to their respective colleges. He helped carry boxes. He assembled furniture. He ate terrible dining hall food and told them it wasn't that bad, which was a lie, and they knew it was a lie, and no one needed to say so. He drove home alone both times. He was not, technically, alone. He had Desmond, who was still around, who came over on Sundays sometimes to watch whatever game was on. He had Bev Strickler, who had become something like a friend over the course of the lawsuit and who called occasionally to tell him about cases that made her angry. He had colleagues at Crossfield he liked and respected. But the house on Clement Street was quiet in a way it hadn't been in 12 years, and he noticed it every day. He thought once in a while about whether he should have handled Aldrin differently, whether there was a version of events where he'd said less, pushed less, kept his head down in his job and his stability. He always arrived at the same conclusion: no, not with Roy Castle, not with the numbers he had seen. He had no regrets. He was just tired, sometimes, in the way that people are tired when they have spent a long time being the person who shows up. 17 years after Garrett drove away from Brody's funeral in wet shoes, he got a phone call from Petra. She did not call to chat. She was not, in adulthood, a person who called to chat. She called when she had something to say. "I need to tell you something," she said, "and I need you to not be weird about it." "I'm never weird," Garrett said. "Dad." "I'm sometimes weird," he allowed. She had been working for the past 4 years at a private equity firm called Meridian Group, out of Philadelphia. Her focus was on distressed acquisitions, companies that were underperforming, financially compromised, or structurally mismanaged, which she had a talent for identifying. Kala, who had spent 8 years building a reputation in sustainable commercial architecture, had recently partnered with her on a separate venture. They were forming their own acquisition and development company. Infrastructure-focused, the kind of work that sat at the intersection of what Petra did and what Kala did. "Okay," Garrett said. He was sitting on the back porch with a cup of coffee. "That sounds like both of you." "There's a company we're looking at," Petra said. "It's been struggling for about 6 years. Bad leadership, some legal exposure from an old safety incident, patents that have been generating licensing revenue, but the core business is basically stagnant." Garrett waited. "Aldrin Solutions," Petra said. "We can buy them at a significant discount. Their core IP is still valuable, the structural load analysis software especially. There are licensing agreements that haven't been properly renegotiated in years, and there are engineering patents attached to that software that, as far as we can tell, were originally developed by a former employee who never received adequate compensation." The porch was quiet. A neighbor's dog was barking somewhere on the next block. "Petra," Garrett said. "I know. How long have you been sitting on this?" 3 months. We wanted to make sure it was viable before we told you." "And is it?" "We wouldn't be calling if it wasn't." He was quiet for a long moment. He watched a cardinal land on the fence at the edge of the yard, look around as if assessing the situation, and fly away. "What do you need from me?" he said. "Your documentation," Petra said. "Everything from your time at Aldrin, the patent filings, the internal communications, the timeline. We have a legal team who wants to look at the original employment contracts and the IP chain of custody." He had kept all of it. He had kept it in a filing cabinet in the spare bedroom for 17 years, the way some people keep things they don't want to need but understand they might. He told Petra he'd scan and send everything by the end of the week. "Dad," she said before he could hang up. "Yeah. Kala wants to redesign the headquarters if we close this. She has opinions." Garrett smiled. "Of course she does. She says the load-bearing specifications in the original structure are embarrassing." "She's probably right." A pause. Then Petra said, more quietly, "We wouldn't be doing this if it weren't. I mean, this is a good investment on its own merits. I want you to know that. We're not doing it just because." "Petra," he said, "I know that's not the kind of person you are." Another pause. "But also," she said. "Also," he said. The acquisition closed 14 months later. Garrett sat in the conference room of a law office in Philadelphia and watched his daughters sign documents with the focused, unhurried certainty of people who understood exactly what they were doing. Kala had worn a blazer. Petra had brought a highlighter and used it, which the attorneys seemed to find slightly unnerving. The legal review had confirmed what Petra's team suspected. 4 of the patents at the core of Aldrin's licensing revenue could be traced directly to Garrett's original filings. The chain of custody was complicated by the employment contracts he had signed in his 20s, but Aldrin's use of those patents beyond the scope of the original agreements, licensing them externally, which had not been specified, gave Garrett's new attorney, a sharper version of Bev's office with twice the staff, significant leverage. The settlement negotiated as part of the acquisition included a retroactive IP agreement that would provide Garrett with a licensing royalty going forward, not a fortune, but something real, something with his name on it, 17 years after he had believed it was simply gone. Fletcher had retired. The executive team that had promoted him had largely turned over. Aldrin Solutions, by the time Petra and Kala reached it, was a company being held together by licensing revenue and institutional inertia, run by people who had inherited problems they didn't fully understand. The new company would be called Meridian Structural, a name that was Petra's idea, neutral enough to carry the business forward without the weight of either the past or any particular sentiment about it. There would be no name on the door that commemorated what Garrett had been through. He didn't want that. He had never wanted that. What he wanted was for the work to matter. And on the day the acquisition closed, Kala slid a folder across the table to him, thick, rubber-banded, with a yellow sticky note on the front in her handwriting. Preliminary drawings, Phase 1 renovation. He opened it. She had redesigned the atrium. The load-bearing columns had been reconfigured using a calculation method she credited, in the technical notes at the bottom of the first page, to a structural analysis technique pioneered by a G. Mullins, circa 2003. He read that twice. "You didn't have to do that," he said. "I know," Calla said in the way she had always said "I know," as if the fact that something wasn't required was entirely beside the point. Petra looked up from her highlighter. "The load tolerances in her design are really good, by the way. I had 2 separate engineers review them." "I know they're good," Garrett said. "She learned from watching me complain about bad ones for 20 years. Calla said, without looking up from her copy of the documents. 15 years. I wasn't paying attention the first 5. Someone laughed. Then more than one person did. The attorneys looked at each other with the mild confusion of people witnessing a family moment they hadn't been briefed on. Garrett drove home alone that evening, which was not the same as driving home lonely. He had learned, somewhere in the long middle stretch of those years, somewhere between the packed lunches and the parking lot lawsuit and the first time Petra called him Dad without thinking about it, that those were different things, and that knowing the difference mattered. The house on Clement Street was still his. He had bought it eventually after the freelancing steadied. The backyard had a garden now, which had been Calla's project one summer when she was 16 and had decided the yard looked, in her words, like nobody cared. He had maintained it ever since, imperfectly, with the particular stubbornness that had apparently been observable to a 9-year-old girl sitting in his back seat in the rain 20 years ago. He sat on the back porch that evening, with the folder of Calla's drawings in his lap and a cup of coffee going cold on the table beside him. The light was doing something specific to the yard. The late afternoon gold of it that made everything look more deliberate than it probably was. He thought about Brody. He did this less than he used to, not because the loss had faded, but because it had found its place. Brody had been a person who showed up. Garrett had tried to be that too, imperfectly, stubbornly, in the only way he knew how. He did not know, sitting at that cemetery parking lot all those years ago, what he was agreeing to. He had not thought it through. He had made a phone call at 6 in the morning because the alternative, 2 little girls, separated, in houses that weren't theirs, was something he couldn't make himself accept. That was all it had been at the beginning, a thing he couldn't accept. Everything else had grown from there, the way things do when you stop waiting for the right conditions and just begin. I keep thinking about that filing cabinet. Garrett kept 17 years of documents in a spare bedroom. Every internal memo, every patent filing, every letter from Aldrin's attorneys, not out of bitterness, but out of something quieter than that. A kind of integrity, the understanding that what happened had happened, that the record of it mattered even if no one ever asked to see it. That's the part I can't stop turning over, not the acquisition. Not the moment Petra slid the signed documents across the table, or the way Calla's technical notes credited a structural method to G. Mullins, circa 2003. Those moments are extraordinary, and they're real, but what made them possible was something much smaller and much harder. A man who decided 17 years earlier to do the right thing even when the cost was immediate and the reward was invisible. Garrett reported a safety defect that his employer wanted buried. He lost his job, his financial stability, 14 months of his life to a lawsuit that shouldn't have existed, and he absorbed all of it without explaining it to the 2 girls sitting at his kitchen table, because they were too young for the details, and because he understood, maybe instinctively, that the way you carry difficulty in front of children is itself a form of teaching. He didn't tell Petra and Calla what to believe. He showed them what a person looks like when they choose honesty over comfort. And they were paying attention. That's what I mean when I think about character, not as an abstract value but as something practiced, daily, in small rooms when no one important is watching. Garrett didn't raise 2 daughters who became capable of buying a company. He raised 2 daughters who became capable of understanding why it mattered. Petra didn't pursue Aldrin out of anger. She pursued them because her legal and financial analysis said the underlying IP was valuable and the company was mismanaged, and also because she knew the history, and she thought the history deserved a different ending. That combination of clear-eyed judgment and moral memory is not an accident. It grows from somewhere. And then there's Calla, who taught herself the load tolerances in Garrett's original patent work well enough to reference them in her architectural designs 20 years later. That's not sentiment, that's rigor. She looked at what her father had built, understood it technically, and found a way to carry it forward in the specific language of her own profession, That kind of discipline, the willingness to do the hard intellectual work of really understanding something, not just honoring it, that's what turns inheritance into something living. I think about what it costs to keep going when the outcome is genuinely uncertain. Garrett didn't know Petra would end up in private equity. He didn't know Calla would become an architect. He didn't know the filing cabinet would ever matter to anyone but him. He just kept coaching the soccer team and making pasta and doing the math on Sunday nights with a pencil, because the alternative, giving up, checking out, becoming smaller, was something he couldn't make himself accept. That refusal is its own kind of strength, not loud, not dramatic, just persistent, in the way that water is persistent, finding its way through whatever is in front of it. What Garrett built wasn't a company, it was a family. And what Petra and Calla built, from everything they had been given and everything they had worked for, was proof that what he built was real. Somdust untundust I'm sawest I'm saw of thens renaha. That doesn't mean they were lost.